we have Mr. Amitav Ghosh. May I request you to please come up and take your seat? I'm fine, thank you. Please. In the middle. Supriya Chaudhuri, Supriya Di, can you please come up? Mr. Mukul Kesavan. And to be in conversation with them, we have Dr. Jayanta Sengupta. Jayanta, the stage is all yours.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the introductory session of the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet 2016, where we discuss the relationship between history and fiction with three stalwarts, Supriya Chaudhuri, Amitav Ghosh, and Mukul Kesavan, none of whom needs any introduction, of course. Now, the older notion of history as a factual account of what really happened in the past, and fiction as completely, essentially a product of the imagination, those older notions have been challenged very substantially in the recent years. And the boundaries between the two, if at all there are boundaries between the two, are being crossed very frequently. And we have with us two leading practitioners of this, Amitav Ghosh and Mukul Kesavan, and an academic, Supriya Chaudhuri, who has closely followed these floor crossings for several decades now. So without further ado, let us plunge right into the subject. We have around 40 minutes for the conversations, and then we will throw the floor open for questions. So we will start with Supriya Di. Supriya Di, you have spent a lifetime as an academic, reading and analyzing literature as well as history, and of course the interconnections between history and fiction. You have also translated literature, and I know that some of your most favorite books are books written by historians, especially those who have pushed at generic boundaries. So I think you are the best person to set up a discussion about sharing with us, by sharing with us some of your thoughts on the narrative, which is used by both the historian and the author of fiction. The nature of the narrative. Are they similar? Are they different? Or what?
I think that I'd like to say that narrative is, in fact, what binds history and fiction together. I think that in writing history, and Mukul will correct us on that, one tries to make sense of the past, one tries to look back at events and construct them into some kind of series, to see them as connected by a chain of causality. And in fiction too, I think that one is taking the fragmented, disjunct material of what seems to be reality and imposing some kind of meaning or order to it. And the primary instrument with which one does this surely is narrative. And I think that Amitav and Mukul will both be able to say much more about this. I'd just like to start by emphasizing narrative in this way and ask others to contribute.
Thank you. Mukul, would you like to share your thoughts on this?
I think I'd endorse everything that Supriya said, except to say that in answer to your question, that I think there is a distinction between the two narratives. It's a distinction that's frequently blurred, and especially so in the last 40 or 50 years, when the claim of history to actually speak to a unitary and given past has been questioned by many. But I think most historians would say that the truth claims made by historical narrative are not of the same, are of a different order in fact, I mean, fiction generally doesn't make truth claims, historical fiction. I think what it does is it tries to create a persuasive circumstance. It sometimes tries to help you suspend disbelief. But I think an important part of the compact between the writer of historical fiction and his reader is the reassurance that there is someone at play here, even if the themes are enormously important, that you have set moving within the official or the sanctified narrative, people whose existential dilemmas you're interested in. That, in a sense, you're straining against the confines of the given historical and also feeding off it. But I think they are two different kinds of narratives. To claim that you can, in a sense, mine War and Peace for a history of the Napoleonic Wars in some authoritative way, I think would be wrong. One could certainly say, though, that it represents, in a way that few historians, indeed no historians, could claim just a magnificent drama set in that context.
Thank you. If I could just push you a little farther on this, and the book that immediately comes to mind is, of course, You're Looking Through Glass. And I wonder, you have been trained as a professional historian, but you have written this historical fiction whose protagonist undertakes time travel and is transported back to his grandmother, who is now dead, whose very ash he was carrying in order to tip into the waters of the Ganges. Now, the question that comes to mind is, and then he makes this journey through the events of, like Quit India movement and communal tensions through the partition and independence. Now, when you undertook to write that novel, who were you in that novel after once he undertakes the time travel and transported back to 1942? Were you being a novelist or a fabulist or a historian? I mean, why did you undertake was this a strategic move to write a novel to tell us what you wanted to tell about these events, but you couldn't as an academic historian?
The thing is that when I began writing this novel, the only thing I actually wanted to do was to write a novel. The impulse was to write fiction, and I suppose the fact that I was a historian, and much of the material that informed my imagination was historical. I can't emphasize too much in my particular case, in this one novel that I wrote, the contingency of it. You begin writing something, it grows into something else, and eventually, after you've gone halfway through a draft, you discover that it is about the past in a particular way. And I think retrospectively, I could look at it and say that that there are things that it helps me do which perhaps a straight telling of the history of the time wouldn't, but that would be to impose a kind of order in it retrospectively. What I did enjoy, though, was this sense of being constrained by a given historical past. I didn't actually set out to write a time-traveling novel. I hit a narrative roadblock and made this person fall into the past because it seemed one way of getting around it. And so one thing happened after another. And I found that it was a lot of fun trying to get my protagonist through a world which I, as the omniscient narrator, knew, and he knew as well through his history books. But to be placed in this predicament is, I think, to know that that hindsight isn't everything.
Supriya,
yes, I'd like to say a little bit about what Mukul was saying. I completely agree that the truth claims of these two kinds of narratives are not the same. And indeed, history makes a kind of claim to truth, to say that this is what really happened. Whereas fiction makes an equally strong claim sometimes to giving us a version of the real. And the real is not necessarily the true. That's a very important lesson that you learn from reading literature. Now, of course, that claim to be saying, representing reality is also, in a sense, it's also conjectural and only a hypothesis, really. It's never tested in the same way that history is tested, that the truth claim of history is tested. You can only claim that your fiction approaches the real by making a kind of imaginative statement. You are, in a sense, wagering on the reality claim of fiction. whereas on the truth claim of history, you are, you're able, as it were, to cover your bits. So I think that what you're doing in fiction is taking much greater risks and claiming that you are in some way able to put us in touch with what is what is real in our experience, but not by answering the truth claim of history, but not by answering that kind of truth claim. And that, I think, is very important and very interesting, that there are two kinds of narratives and they are speaking to each other in different ways.
Thank you so much, Supriya. That's an extremely interesting statement to make, that by writing fiction, you are undertaking greater risks. And we can probably come back to the rewards of taking those risks at a later point. But I wanted to, go to Amitav. Amitav, you are, of course, the leading practitioner of all of this. You have seamlessly traveled back and forth in time, and the boundaries between history and fiction in all of your work, in The Shadowlines, In an Antique Land, The Glass Palace, and most recently and stunningly in the IBS trilogy. Now, I remember a few years ago you said that a storyteller, and you are a storyteller par excellence, a storyteller is nothing other than a historian working with invented sources. Now, what exactly did you mean by that? And where do you see yourself as a storyteller in relation to that statement?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for those kind remarks. Well, historians, one of the interesting things that's happened in fiction in the last 30, 40 years is exactly this, that many novelists do work with invented archives. If you consider Umberto Eco in The Name of the Rose, if you consider the Da Vinci Code, that's built around an invented archive.
Calcutta Chromosome?
The Calcutta Chromosome, if you like. But you can go much further back. Henry James wrote the Aspen Papers, which is about similarly about an invented archive. So it's one of the tropes which you see, that makes a certain kind of fiction possible. But I must say here that I completely agree with Mukul and with Supriya that history and fiction are separated in terms of the truth claims that they make. And I certainly know that as I write fiction, that one of the first things you do is that you relinquish a certain kind of truth claim. And I very much admire, what historians do. Many of my friends are historians, like Mukul. I see the work that they do. I see how deeply they immerse themselves in the archive and, the discipline that it takes. And I very much admire what they do. And it's the work that I do would not often be possible without that work behind it. At the same time, I would also say two things. One is that the case of Tolstoy is interesting and important because Tolstoy refused to consider himself a novelist. It's not that he necessarily considered himself a historian, but he was doing something else in his own view. And he was working very closely with sources. But what is particularly interesting about War and Peace is that Tolstoy actually decided the way in which Russian history would be read until quite recently. Dominic Levin, who actually wrote the anti-Tolstoy, if you like, admits this. He says that for 150 years, Tolstoy's War and Peace has decided how Russian history is to be narrated. And I think this is something that one doesn't take enough account of, that often, in fact, the fiction creates the context for the history, The other thing I would say is that, you made this very interesting point that history is about what happened. But I could say equally that historical fiction is about what was experienced or what was felt. Now, in that sense, which is addressing the reality is not clear to me, because of course, there is a structure of events, but that other structure of what you experience, what people feel, I think most people here would say that is actually more real than just the events that occur.
Thank you so much, Amitav Da. Supriya, you wanted to?
Yes, I had a quick point to make about Tolstoy, because all of us seem to be coming back to Tolstoy. You remember Isaiah Berlin wrote that brilliant little book called An Essay on the Hedgehog and the Fox, an essay on Tolstoy's view of history. And there, that really defeats my claim, my initial statement that both history and fiction have narratives in them. Because I think Tolstoy, at least Berlin, is saying there that Tolstoy's view of history is that there is no narrative, that it's just such a large number of events which are potentially uncoordinated and unrelated, and it's impossible to extract any kind of historical narrative from this. And therefore, the imposition of some kind of historical narrative on it is ultimately the doing of a fiction writer, in a sense. I mean, that history is not really a narrative at all. And it's a brilliant book, a little book, but a very brilliant book. That was one thing. And the second thing that I'd like to say is that if you think of Natalie Zeman Davis's book, Fiction in the Archives, that seems to suggest that there's a great deal of fiction in history. So that in history itself, which is supposed to be about what really happened, there are so many different versions of what really happened, as in a film that we all know, Rashomon. A single story can be told from so many different angles, as Natalie Zeman Davis says in Fiction in the Archives, that there are so many different versions of the events that within the archive itself there is fiction born. Now, what would you say about that?
I just wanted to say that in response to what Amitav said about fiction trying to, in a sense, reconstruct feeling, or a theorist of history who's read, but I think not necessarily taken seriously enough, is Collingwood. And Collingwood has this wonderful passage where he's talking about the importance of written sources for the historian, because he says only through them can the historian perform the act of empathy, of entering into the minds of his protagonists. That this, in some way, is the historian's ultimate claim. And I think Amitav is right in saying that it's one of the things that a historical novelist does, both with license and with a kind of fullness, that historians, constrained in a sense by their sources, fail to do, and in a sense fail, therefore, critically to perform part of that great historical act of understanding. I also wanted to say that, when we talk of historical fiction, I think it's useful in a rough and ready way to say that there are two kinds of historical fiction. One kind of historical fiction is, if you will, the generic kind, which is intended to persuade you that this is the world as it was, and then to set in motion private lives within this world. And part of the pleasure of this fiction is, to relive, say, Regency England, or to relive, 18th century India or something. And this could be the literary novel. It could also be a more popular kind of novel. But I think that the best kinds of historical fictions, including Tolstoy, I think of Gunter Grass's Tin Drum, I think of Amitav's Ibis Trilogy, the best kinds of historical fictions have designs upon you. I mean, there is a sense in which you feel this strong authorial presence. When you read War and Peace, it's extraordinary. This man is writing this epic narrative, and everybody who has ever reviewed him said that it's literally as if real life were moving on a platform in front of you. And then what does he do? He stops the narrative dead and proceeds on this 30-page disquisition about the individual and action and history. I mean, in the same way, you have Grass in the Tin Drum using this metaphor of this arrested child to speak of, in a sense, war-torn and post-war Germany and the enormous attempt it had to make to grow into any kind of republican maturity. And in the Ibis Trilogy, you have very clearly, right through it, one of the protagonists of this trilogy is this sense of historical wonder and outrage at these events that are being otherwise narrated in so many different registers, comic, sexual, bawdy, serious, violent. So I think the historical fictions that are truly, not literary, but truly powerful, are the ones that make no bones about the fact that they attend both to the history that they address and also about the large concerns that history creates in the mind of the author.
Thank you. Now, going further a little bit on that, and Supriya talked about the author of the fiction taking risks, greater risks than the historian, which has its rewards. So do you think, and this is a question to Amitav in the first place, but then Mukul can join in here, is that, do you think therefore that there is a need to try and overcome the limitations of the historical archive and to recover the small and neglected voices of history, as you have done, by your use of language, a pastiche, a patchwork quilt of language, dialects, pidgin, and use them to help the reader not only to read about the past, but to help him inhabit the past, as it were?
That's a very difficult question because, as Mukul says, it's true that, it's only when you have some sort of reliable source that you can actually enter into that empathy. The problem really is that for us, writing about India's past, we just don't have those sources. That's just the case. If you consider that from 1760 to 1914, literally millions of Indians fought as sepoys for the British Indian Army, and in this entire period, there is not a single reliably attributed memoir. Not a single reliably attributed account of the soldier's experience. The only one that exists is Sitaram Subedar, which is maybe apocryphal. The actual text has never been found. And even if the text were found, it appears that the man who was taking down the dictation was automatically translating it into English, whereas the actual text the actual recounting of it was in Awadhi. So, these are the things that we really have to confront, when we try to deal with an Indian past, that, what meets us is this profound withdrawal, this incredible silence on the part of Indian protagonists. And in a way, that is what pushes one into fiction, because, in my book, In an Antique Land, I tried very hard to sort of recreate a historical presence, and that is not a novel, it's very much a non-fiction. It's a book of non-fiction. I tried to recreate a historical presence through tiny fragments. But in the case especially of, say, Indian soldiers, Indian indentured migrants, in the 19th century, we are really just looking at a vast blank, where it becomes almost impossible to explore that terrain. I'd also like to say here, though, it wasn't, at the risk of, harping on Tolstoy too much, but what is interesting about Tolstoy is that, Tolstoy is writing at a moment when the idea of the mass suddenly becomes very important, when ideas of randomness and probability also become very important. So for Tolstoy, what he's really doing is that he's trying to tell you that there is no narrative here, it's all just accidents, it's masses of people acting in a sort of blind way. But actually Tolstoy was wrong. That's what's really interesting. The Tsar had a carefully thought out plan. His entire battle plan was to draw Napoleon further and further into Russia, to trap him in the winter. So, actually, it was a very well thought out a war plan. So, in that sense, Tolstoy was profoundly wrong,
Yeah. Mukul, if you...
The reason we return to Tolstoy, I think, is because, he's written the greatest historical novel it's possible to actually write. And Amitav's right. There is a sense in which Tolstoy is illustrating a theory and precisely trying to demonstrate that the actions of the elite, self-confident though they are, are trivial and pathetic because as they work their way down, to the mass, they become incoherent. And what then occurs is independent of policy or volition. I think, though, one of the interesting things about Amitav mentioned the problems of actually trying to recreate an Indian past, for which there are no sources, simply because of the nature of power, the nature of literacy and illiteracy. It's something that the subaltern school alerted us to, the changes in the directions of the subaltern school's historiography, the move from trying to recover the past of the poor and the subaltern to reading the texts of the elite to decode them in a sense to tell us something about that world. All of these bear witness to the difficulty of making this grand claim that you're going to recover the past of anything other than the people who rule the world. Paradoxically, the more we became conscious of the fact that we were writing a very narrow history of the state, the more we also became conscious of the fact that we write the history of the state because it's the available archive to write from. And Amitav is right that it is the sweep of imaginative fiction that often gives us a historical world which is plausible and which may well shape the historical agenda as Tolstoy did, but which I still think doesn't actually live or die by its claim to authenticity, but in a sense uses the particular historical event to illustrate themes that live on long after the world for which the writer writes that novel and its interest in that particular historical incident has actually passed.
Sure. I just, as a student of history, I had a question to ask Amitav da. You have had conversations with some of the most outstanding historians of our time, like Natalie Zemon Davis, like Jonathan Spence, Sir Chris Clark, Dipesh Chakraborty. And not only have these historians admired your work, but they have said that they have learned from you. What do you think they have learned from you? Is it new archives, new sources, or new connections of global history, new networks, or a completely new use of historical imagination altogether? I just want.
Well, thank you. Yes, I feel very, very fortunate that these great historians have read my work sympathetically and have spoken well of it. I feel really blessed because I think historians are not known for their generosity necessarily to their colleagues. But I mean, I feel very fortunate in that. But I will say one thing, I think most great historians like Natalie or Chris or Jonathan Spence, the reason they start writing history is because they loved reading historical fiction. It's historical fiction that brings them into history, and that's what makes them initially engaged with history, that it makes the past alive in some way. And certainly when I was studying history in Delhi University, you didn't get the sense that the historians there had come into history through fiction. I mean, they were sort of like, these heavy social scientist types who were sort of interested in crunching numbers and so on. And I think one of the reasons for that is exactly because, plausible fictions of the past didn't exist, And I do hope that, people will start telling different stories about the Indian past because I think to leave it only to historians is irresponsible.
That's a good answer.
Yes. Yeah, please.
I just wanted to make, about a point about the uses of historical fiction. I'm thinking of what I always think of as the greatest historical novel of the second half of the 20th century, which is this magnificent novel by Mario Vargas Llosa called The War of the End of the World, which is a novel based very much in a historically grounded insurrection that takes place in Brazil. It's a kind of millenarian insurrection. There's this charismatic preacher who in the Badlands and the hinterland of Brazil creates this ragtag army of the poor. And the novel essentially deals with how this completely corrupt Republican establishment and its completely corrupt and gaudy army and its equally corrupt journalists deal with this record, understand and engage with this extraordinary and bizarre insurrection. And sometimes I think that who can actually say that the War of the End of the World is not actually a truer account of a dozen great insurrections and a dozen corrupt republics than all the hundreds of books that have been written in this fragmentary way. Because when I read it, I think, every Indian civil servant and every Indian soldier who's ever worked in Kashmir or in the Northeast should actually read this as a text. Every television anchor who reports on circumstances of great violence and great emotion should read this, because it is a magnificent novel which takes history as its subject, but sets in motion real characters who are fictionalized and fictional characters who stand for institutions and also are functional characters in themselves, and creates a reality which is truly magnificent and powerful.
Yes, I'd like to say that, I really admired this novel by Mario Vargas Llosa that you spoke of, but I'd like to remember here one very great Bengali novel, similarly of the last half of the 20th century. This is Akhtaruzzaman Ilyas's Khwabnama, which I think is probably the greatest Bengali novel written in the 20th century. And again, it makes this kind of very extraordinary use of his historical material in order to create a completely, a kind of supernatural reality, so the natural and the supernatural are completely fused in that work. But I'd like to make a further point about something that Amitav said about, and that he put very movingly about looking at Indian history and finding a blank because there are not enough sources, and especially about the lives of ordinary people. The great mass of people who lived and died and suffered have left no written records with which to recreate their lives. So those lives have to be imagined. You spoke also of the mass, and I wanted to come to a distinction that is sometimes made in judging historical fiction, that on the one hand you have imagined characters who very often belong to this class of ordinary people, the suffering millions as it were, and there is the world historical figure who is sometimes used to legitimize the fiction, like an encounter with Napoleon, or suddenly the Duke of Wellington appears, or whatever. And I find it really remarkable and powerful, Amitav, that you don't use that kind of person, that you don't need to rely on what Lukács called the world historical fiction, the world historical figure, in order to legitimize your fiction, that your fiction is genuinely about those who are not, whose presence, of course, is there in the archive, but who have not left their own witness. They have not testified themselves to their experiences. So it is really a feat of the imagination to bring them back, and it is for that reason that fiction is so important to the historian too, because what can the historian do if the archive doesn't provide the material? The historian can only ground her or his empathy on the empathy of a literary writer. And that, I think, is very, very important with the work that both Mukul and Amitav have done.
Yes, thank you so much, Supriya, for bringing up that point. You have mentioned Natalie Zemon Davis's Fiction in the Archives. You brought up Akhtaruzzaman Ilyas's Khwabnama. This is just a curiosity. This is a question that I would like to ask all of you. Who, in your opinion, are the best authors who are pushing these boundaries between history and fiction? Who are the best practitioners of this art? Maybe we can start with Supriya again, and then Mukul, and then Amitav.
Can I take a little more time to think?
Yes, please.
One example comes to mind. I remember many years ago, some 30 years ago, I was in Ahmedabad in NID, and I was meant to meet someone. It was a very hot day, and that person was late. So I was in this apartment that was, for some reason, full of lizards, sort of geckos crawling all around me. And my only solace was this book that I had bought at the airport called Beloved by Toni Morrison. And it's, it's strange to talk about it in this context, because when you read the novel, as when you read the best historical fiction, the first thing that that doesn't in fact strike you is that this is a historical novel. I mean, the first thing that strikes you is that this is an astonishing story. But it's very much a historical novel. It's an attempt to do what both Supriya and Amitav have spoken on, to actually recreate the lives of poor people, in this case, black slaves, who did not necessarily leave their thoughts behind. And it has this wonderful opening where the protagonist's mother, I think her name is Baby Suggs, is dying, and she says, I want to see color. So the protagonist sticks her tongue out. And there's a kind of heartbreaking power to this sense that they have so little materially that even color is a kind of body part. It's a great novel. But it's a novel that observes, as far as I can see, none of the protocols of historical fiction. There's no large attempt made to detail costume or render sort of physical structures in a kind of period way. It's almost as if she inhabits the consciousness of people in the sort of antebellum South, and produces this extraordinary and vivid story, which of course owes its power to her special genius, but also to the extraordinary theme she's chosen for herself. So there's a kind of coming together of a great theme and a great writer, which produces something which is the best literary fiction, and a part of his literariness. And I want to stress this because too often historical fiction is marginalized, especially in the context of Anglo-American fiction, which seems to live by the conceit that every story happens in this taken for granted way that everybody shares. Of course, everybody doesn't share it. It's precisely the people who don't share that world who need to contextualize their worlds. And I think this is what Toni Morrison does here just superlatively well. And it's the best kind of historical fiction.
Thank you. Do you need more time?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd just like to say to that, as far as I'm concerned, all novels are historical novels, because all novels are, almost all novels are written in the past tense. They're about things that happened. They may have happened yesterday rather than 100 years ago. But in some sense, really every important novel or almost every important novel that we read is about something that happened in the past. Like Moby Dick is like, something that happened 60 years before. It's actually quite rare to come across a novel which is right in the here and now. So in that sense, all novels really are historical fiction. The second thing I would say about what Mukul says is about Beloved, which is, of course, an absolutely great novel. But the reason that it can take place in that way, without, as it were, taking the trouble to conjure detail or costume or whatever, is because it's written against the background of a very thick understanding of what already exists. So the ordinary American or the ordinary reader has a very clear visual and textual idea of the antebellum South. If you were to try doing that with the lives of 19th century indentured workers from India, it would be unreadable, because nobody would have any idea of what it's about, or, of the context. So in that sense, what writers like myself face is this double burden of trying to create a context and to excavate that context, and then also finding the narrative.
Well, I don't want to take, thank you for that. And when you ask for names, like who is your favorite author, it's very, very difficult to respond. And I thought Mukul did that brilliantly by, just looking at a novel that he likes very much, and that was a great novel, Beloved. And, asking about who is writing today, who are the best writers. It's very, very difficult, as Amitav absolutely correctly said, all novels are historical novels. If we accept present company, then I don't know who to name, because I mean, here am I sitting between and sitting next to a great historical novelist. But I'd like to mention a novel that I read recently. This is the Booker Prize-winning novel by Richard Flanagan, The Long Road to the Deep North, or whatever it's called. Anyway, I thought it was, in fact, a very brave attempt at excavating a history, a past that had not been sufficiently written about, and that is, I think, very powerfully imagined in that novel. I will not, place it above this one or other. I just would like to say that there is very fine historical writing going on now, today, and it's important to recognize it, and important to recognize particularly that whenever a writer trains her imagination on the stuff of experience, that writer is producing a history. That history is, it can be, as it were, made part of formal academic history, or it can be allowed to root itself in the imagination. The choice is very much that of the writer producing that narrative. It's also a choice that carries its own rigors, and its own risks. So it isn't easier to write imaginatively. It's also, of course, a very difficult choice to write actual history.
I want to respond to that, actually, especially this Flanagan's book. Because I wonder if you saw Raghu Karnad's piece on it.
I should have mentioned it. Actually, that I think is a brilliant book. Yes.
Raghu Karnad actually wrote a bit about Flanagan's book, where he points out that the vast majority, actually 90% of the workers who were working on the death railway were Asians, most of them Indians, in fact. And they have no place in this narrative. Secondly, I want to make the point, again, this is a very good example of the experience being the effect of a discourse. Because, we already know the discourse of the death railway. We know that, it comes to us through the bridge over the River Kwai. It comes to us, so we think of this appalling circumstance, this torture, this hell. But I'll tell you, when I was researching the Glass Palace in Malaysia, I met the son of a man who had served in the death railway and had died there, And when I met him, I said to him, what did your father say about this death railway? And he said to me, he didn't say very much. And I said, well, why not? And he said, for the white men, this was a terrible experience of hell and torture. But for us, it was not very much different from our life on the plantation. So in that sense, you could never create that kind of, you could create a narrative which is, as it were, piggybacking on the white narrative of the experience of the death railway. And I think at some point Indians will probably start to do this, and I hope they do it in a considered way, because actually what is really important about this story is exactly this, that the lives that they were experiencing in the plantations, which is an unspoken, unwritten life, was not that different from what they experienced in the death railway. It was different only because the race of the person experiencing it was different.
I'd like to thank you very much for that corrective. It's very valuable corrective. I really appreciate and have learned from this. But I would like to, because Raghu Karnad was mentioned, let me just mention Raghu Karnad's brilliant book, Farthest Field, an Indian story of the Second World War, which again I think is a brilliant recent book which is pushing at the boundaries of history and fiction together.
I just wanted to say, in connection with what Amitav said about the fact that the kinds of historical novels that you can write depends very much upon the kind of documentation or availability of that historical period. That there is a sense in which the antebellum South is densely, vividly recorded. There are great histories of it. And it's quite interesting to see how the availability of the densely recorded history actually shapes the nature of the historical novel. I'm thinking of Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall. And what's interesting is, it's a marvelous novel, but if you look at its subject matter is essentially giving us Henry VIII from a kind of Cromwellian perspective. And much of the interest of the novel is the point of view and the way in which that point of view is created. It's almost as if it's possible to write a dense, rich, narrow-cast historical novel, which doesn't necessarily raise large questions. So in a sense, you translate wonderfully well, the novel of individual lives. You transpose it into a wonderfully written evocation of these people as individual characters. But if you compare this to the attempt of, say, Vargas Llosa or Amitav, to even, and I think Amitav makes an important point there, to even begin to talk about individual lives, you have to create out of whole cloth what might have actually happened. Because it's not as if that period has been walked through by a dozen different novelists and 100 different historians, and God knows how many different television serials. You literally reinvent that world. And in fact, the one follows upon the other, because Wolf Hall is now a television serial. So the one doubles back upon the other, creating an ever richer tapestry of recognition.
Thank you. I think we are running out of time. We have to throw this open to the floor. But before we do so, just a quick question to Mukul. You have written so much on cricket. We love your cricket blog. Even Amitav Ghosh has cricket in his River of Smoke. Why don't you?
Let me tell you that Amitav is filled with a hatred of cricket that is barely imaginable. I mean, in his spare time, Amitav's hobby is in fact ranting about cricket. It's what he does every spare moment he has.
Amitav, do you want to respond?
I want to say something about cricket.
Cricket figures in River of Smoke only in one game that they play in Canton, because I think actually cricket came to India from China. And I'm waiting for the day when one Chinese village takes up cricket and becomes instantly the best team in the world.
That's another session in the next Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet. Okay, I'm sure we had a fascinating conversation between three stalwarts. I'm sure the audience have many, many questions. We can take a few.
Talking about pushing boundaries.
Could you please stand up and say tell us your name, please?
I'm Anit Mukherjee. I'm a freelancer. I write for the Statesman.
Sure.
Talking about pushing boundaries, is it possible that the idealistic leanings of a fiction writer can change the course of history and truth through his own utopian thinking?
Who is this question addressed to?
Anyone.
It has to be Amitav.
It has to be Amitav.
I don't think any writer could honestly claim to try to change the course of history. But I'll tell you this, that certainly, what is interesting about looking at history really close up, to look at, say, our history as it probably was actually experienced by people, is really to learn that the history that we have had presented to us is the made-up version, and is presented to us as a made-up version out of a certain kind of idealism, perhaps, or whatever you like, or whatever that is. So, which is more in conflict with what the reality of experience was. It's hard to tell.
The gentleman at the back, please tell us your name and keep the questions
brief. My name is Brigadier Samir Bhattacharya, and it is not a question, it's an observation. Because I found that most of the bestsellers that I have read, and based on history, and which were novels, like say Gone with the Wind, or whether it was Dr. Zhivago, or whether it was Ernest Hemingway's books, or whether it was From Here to Eternity, they were all based on certain turning points in history. And they all became very good bestsellers because that was a turning point in the history of that country or for the world for that matter. And the best part is that all of them became very good movies. And having become, most of them became Oscar winners. And therefore I feel that people who write such kind of novels, with that depth, with fictional characters and bring in reality, then has a very big impact on people who read it.
Thank you. Okay, the gentleman at the back there, after that you. Please, at this point we don't really want observations or comments. Please have questions.
My name is A.K. Siddiqui. I'm a humble journalist as well as a novel writer. I'm writing my first novel called The Black Hole, circa 1756. Now, there are very interesting points which Mr. Amitav Ghosh as well as Mukul Kesavan has said. It's very interesting, but the point I would like to understand is there's a strong role of poets in history, whether it's Shakespeare, Ghalib, or any other poet, Homer for that matter, Homer's Iliad. Now, what Mr. Amitav Ghosh particularly feels about the blankness, in terms of the gap, the missing gaps, how does a poet fill that gap in any country or any situation? Of course, one can't be too particular about this, but I would like an answer to the role of poets and poetry in terms of encompassing, reality or history, in their work.
Role of poets.
I have to say that nothing immediately comes to mind, but this is, without any doubt on account of my literacy in poetry. So I'm going to pass this to Supriya.
Well, I would like to say that I think that here you cannot make a distinction between the poet and the fiction writer, because in a larger sense, all people who are producing literature are poets. In that sense, Homer is as much a historian as he is a poet, as he is a fiction writer. So I think that if you use that larger sense of poet in the sense of every literary writer is a poet, then we have been talking about that relation of poetry and history from the beginning. Aristotle talked about the relation of poetry and history, and there by poetry he meant all imaginative literature. He said that poetry is truer than history because it's able to imagine and tell you what is probable, whereas history tells you only what is possible.
There, and then we will pass there, yeah. At the last row, yes.
Good evening, one and all present here. There has been a lot of discussion on the truth value of fiction and history. I was wondering whether self-reflexivity on the part of the historian can be an instrumental tool in overcoming the limitations. And my second question is for Supriya. In fact, I had Lukács in mind too, and it is indeed true that for writing a historical fiction, we often pay great importance to great figures. And we certain there's a need to excavate micro-histories. But in the process of excavating micro-histories, if we tend to leave out the so-called iconic figures, isn't that also a kind of exclusion too? Or does that leave room for further exploration of these characters from a new light? Would you like to comment on that?
Who is your first question addressed to?
Amitav, sir.
Amitav, sir.
I think those are very, very good points, actually. I think they're very good points. It is the case, that, as I was saying in relation to War and Peace, that he does, in some profound sense, distort the role that the Tsar played in this, in the war with. The war against Napoleon. What's also interesting is your mention of micro-histories, because I think actually these micro-histories are the cutting edge of history right now, if you like. I mean, what's so interesting is the ways in which these micro-histories, especially written by, say, feminists and gender theorists and and so on, they really give you a sense of the ways in which they're trying to capture individual presences within history, you know. So particularly if you take Natalie Zeman Davis's book on The Return of Martin Guerre, it's so much like a novel in some way, you know. I mean, you really have a sense of the individual characters. But equally, I'll say that Partha Chatterjee's book about
Princely Imposter.
The Princely Imposter is a wonderful example of the ways in which a microhistory gives you a sense of a time and a place within a narrative.
About the second part of your question, I think that I would still say that it is better to leave out these great world historical characters. I would agree with Amitav that it is the stuff of ordinary life, the microhistory, the excavation of the forgotten people of history that provides a sense of a unique space for us to move in, to understand, to build up a sense of that larger past. Whereas if attention is concentrated on the what Lukács calls the world historical figure, I think that that does produce a certain kind of imbalance, because history has always been written about world historical figures. Let me just remind you of, because I am a literary historian, let me just remind you of a passage in Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, where Catherine Morland is a young girl and she is forced to read, her school subjects, and she finds history particularly boring and uninteresting, and she says that it's all about popes and kings and princes and scarcely any women at all. And I think that that is really very revealing, that it's all about popes and kings and princes and scarcely any women at all. And it is in Northanger Abbey that you have a great defense of the novel. Somewhat later, this young girl puts a novel aside and says, oh, it is only a novel. And then the novelist breaks into the narrative and says, it is only a novel, but a novel is, a great testimony to truth and human reality and so on. So I think that that is what a woman writer writing in the 19th century is telling us about the power of fiction to reclaim and redeem the imperfections of canonical history.
Thank you. A question there.
Thank you, Mukul, Amitav and Supriya, for a cracking start to Kolkata Literary Meet this year. I was particularly fascinated by the exchange between Mukul and Amitav on Amitav's response to Mukul's comment on Beloved, the lack of historical furniture in Beloved, and Amitav, your compulsion in Ibis trilogy to portray that extremely rich tapestry that you had to basically excavate. And I thought of putting a question which I think will involve all three of you. I was thinking of an author from Kolkata, Neil Mukherjee's The Lives of Others, which is a very interesting novel set in against the Naxal movement in Calcutta. But I find Neil's weaving of autobiography and history and his piling on of detail over detail, sort of excavated from recent history, almost artificial and for the sake of artifice. And I think all three of you may have something to say, given that I think one of Neil's novels is also dedicated to you, Supriya.
Thank you. That will be the last question, ladies and gentlemen.
I can't really comment on this because I haven't read Neil's novel, so I'll pass this to.
Why don't you reply first? Well, I don't have a great deal to say. I admired that novel very greatly. And I think that one thing that's very interesting about it is that we spoke of narrative. There is a narrative there, but have you noticed how the the chronology is changing. It's all the time. He's shifting from one moment in the past to another moment in the past to something that is in between. And so there isn't any linear or serial development of the plot. I think that that's a very, very, again, an interesting and bold step that he takes in interfering with chronological linearity and attempting to weave a pattern out of something that is non-linear but is nevertheless telling a story.
Amitav, do you want to?
I think it's a very important novel. I've reviewed it and written about it at some length, so I'm not going to go over all that. I think, just to remember one of the passages where he describes rice planting, I think that's it adds a great deal in terms of texture and detail. I thought those were, in many ways, the best parts of the book.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have been treated to an extravaganza of conversation on the relationship between history and fiction. We had been captivated, but like all good things, it must also come to an end. And it has certainly been our privilege to listen to these conversations among three stalwart minds. And it is a most befitting introduction to the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking these three outstanding minds, Supriya Chaudhuri, Amitav Ghosh, and Mukul Kesavan. Thank you very much.